The phone rang in Washington on a cold winter morning, and with that single call, an entire chapter of the Second World War quietly closed. It was late December 1945, and the message that reached Dwight David Eisenhower was brutally simple. George Smith Patton was dead. No battlefield, no final command, just silence. For 3 years, Eisenhower had lived in constant tension with the most dangerous, brilliant, and uncontrollable general under his command. Now that tension was gone. And for the first time since the war began, Eisenhower no longer had to measure his words. What Eisenhower said afterward, in private letters, in guarded conversations, and in moments when politics no longer mattered, revealed a truth he had buried beneath necessity. Patton was not merely effective, he was irreplaceable. Losing him, Eisenhower later admitted, felt like losing the sharpest weapon the war had ever produced. And yet, that weapon had always been as dangerous to its owner as it was to the enemy. Before the Supreme Commander and his most volatile subordinate existed, there were simply two young officers trying to imagine a future no one else could see. Camp Meade, 1919. The First World War had ended, and the United States Army was shrinking back into peacetime complacency. Eisenhower and Patton were both captains in a newly formed experimental tank corps, a strange assignment that many senior officers considered a dead end. They spent long days tearing apart engines, arguing doctrine, sketching battle concepts on scrap paper, and dreaming about a kind of war that did not yet exist. Patton came from privilege, an old military family, absolute confidence, and first-hand combat experience in Mexico and France. Eisenhower came from Kansas farmland, had missed combat entirely, and carried a quiet insecurity that he masked with discipline and patience. On paper, they should not have understood each other at all, but they did. Both believed tanks were not support weapons but the future of warfare itself. Speed mattered more than perfection. Shock mattered more than caution. A mechanized force, properly unleashed, could break an enemy before they understood what was happening. The Army disagreed. Their ideas were dismissed as reckless, even career-ending. Patton, wealthy and well-connected, could afford to be outspoken. Eisenhower could not. He learned early when to speak and when to stay silent. That difference would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. More than 2 decades later, those two captains stood at the center of the largest war in human history. Eisenhower became Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Patton became the most feared American general in the field. Their early friendship survived, but it was buried under hierarchy, politics, and impossible responsibility. Eisenhower now had to control Patton, defend him, restrain him, and occasionally sacrifice him for the greater alliance. Patton resented it. He believed Eisenhower had become too political, too cautious, too obsessed with coalition management. Patton wanted decisive battle, not negotiation. Eisenhower wanted victory that would not fracture the alliance holding the war together. One had vision and restraint. The other had raw force and momentum. Together, they were unstoppable. Apart, they were dangerous. That danger became public in Sicily during the summer of 1943. Patton, commanding the 7th Army, encountered soldiers suffering what would later be called post-traumatic stress. To Patton, they were cowards. In 2 separate incidents, he struck hospitalized soldiers and publicly humiliated them. Word spread. Journalists caught wind. Politicians demanded answers. The American public was outraged. Eisenhower faced one of the most critical decisions of his command. He could destroy Patton's career to protect the image of the Army, or he could shield him and risk political disaster. He chose a third path. Patton was formally reprimanded, forced to apologize publicly to soldiers, medical staff, and the entire Army. The punishment was real, visible, and humiliating. But it stopped short of removal. Why? Because Eisenhower was already planning the invasion of France. And he knew something he could never say out loud. He needed Patton. Sicily had proven it. Patton moved faster, struck harder, and demoralized German forces more effectively than any other American commander. His army advanced at a pace that made traditional doctrine irrelevant. British forces moved methodically. Patton surged forward. German commanders began to fear not just American power, but American speed. Eisenhower defended Patton repeatedly to George Marshall, Franklin Roosevelt, and the War Department. He promised control. He promised discipline. He promised it would never happen again. But privately, Eisenhower wrestled with an uncomfortable truth. He did not agree with Patton's actions, but he understood Patton's instincts. War required men who could endure psychological pressure. That belief could not be publicly defended, but it was not entirely wrong. If this kind of behind-the-scenes tension between leadership and necessity fascinates you, take a moment right now to support the channel. This video is free, but it costs a like, a comment, and a subscription. It helps more than you think. As preparations for the invasion of France continued, Eisenhower faced another problem: deception. The Germans had to believe the main invasion would land at Calais, not Normandy. The solution was Operation Fortitude, an elaborate illusion built from fake armies, false radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and staged bases. At the center of it all was Patton. To the Germans, Patton was the invasion. They trusted his aggression more than Allied intelligence reports. Entire German divisions remained pinned near Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. The deception saved thousands of Allied lives. Patton hated it. He wanted to fight, not perform. Being used as bait while others stormed the beaches felt like humiliation. Eisenhower could not explain that Patton was more valuable as a phantom than as a commander during those critical weeks. Patton learned the truth only after the war. Even then, the bitterness remained. When Patton finally received command of the Third Army in France in late summer 1944, everything Eisenhower had believed since 1919 became reality. Patton unleashed a campaign of movement so fast it shattered German command structures. Cities fell in hours. Enemy units collapsed before they could reorganize. Eisenhower watched with pride and fear, knowing that Patton was proving every theory they had once whispered over broken engines decades earlier. But speed created problems. Logistics strained. Other Allied commanders could not keep up. Eisenhower had to slow Patton down, redirect supplies, and balance political agreements with military opportunity. Patton saw delay as betrayal. Eisenhower saw restraint as survival. Their relationship, once built on shared dreams, now existed in constant friction. And the war had not yet delivered its final crisis. That crisis was coming. The crisis arrived in silence, hidden beneath snow and pine trees, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. In mid-December 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive that tore through thin American lines. Entire divisions were surrounded. Supply routes vanished overnight. For the first time since the landings in France, the Allied advance did not merely slow. It bent backward. Eisenhower understood the danger immediately. This was not just a tactical setback. If mishandled, it could fracture Allied morale and hand the Germans a political victory they could not earn militarily. He summoned his senior commanders to an emergency meeting in Verdun. The atmosphere was grim. Omar Bradley was shaken. Bernard Montgomery was cautious as ever. Others spoke of defensive lines, withdrawals, and waiting for reinforcements. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. The question he asked was simple, but everyone in the room understood its weight. Patton's Third Army was facing east, deep into Germany. To respond, he would have to halt an offensive, pivot an entire army 90 degrees, and attack through snow, ice, and enemy armor. Most commanders would need weeks. Patton did not hesitate. He opened a small notebook. He had already considered the scenario during his drive. Without drama, he looked up and said he could attack with 3 divisions by December 22nd. 72 hours. The room went quiet. Some officers thought he was grandstanding. Others thought he was reckless. Bradley looked unconvinced. But Eisenhower knew Patton well enough to understand something crucial. Patton never made promises he had not already prepared to keep. "Do it," Eisenhower said. And Patton left the room. What followed was one of the most extraordinary logistical maneuvers of the war. Entire corps reversed direction in brutal winter conditions. Engineers laid roads through frozen ground. Military police redirected traffic in blizzards. Tanks slid off icy slopes. Engines froze. Men collapsed from exhaustion. And still, the army moved. On the morning Patton had promised, his division struck the German flank exactly as planned. The momentum of the enemy offensive shattered. What had threatened to become a catastrophic defeat became a grinding German failure. The relief of Bastogne became a symbol of American resilience. For Eisenhower, it was confirmation of something he had always known, but could never openly admit. When everything fell apart, Patton was the one commander who could act inside chaos. Publicly, Eisenhower praised the collective effort. Privately, he understood the truth. Every controversy, every apology, every political compromise involving Patton had led to that moment. It had been worth it. But the war did not end with triumph alone. As victory approached, Patton's greatest strengths began turning into liabilities. His outspoken hostility toward former Nazi officials, his aggressive stance toward the Soviets, and his inability to adapt to peacetime politics became impossible to ignore. The qualities that made Patton invaluable in war made him dangerous in peace. Eisenhower faced another impossible decision. He relieved Patton of command, not because Patton had failed, but because he could no longer be controlled. It was one of the most painful choices Eisenhower ever made. Their final conversations were strained, bitter, and unresolved. Patton felt betrayed. Eisenhower felt trapped by responsibility. Then came the accident, a routine vehicle collision in Germany. 12 days later, George Patton was gone. Only then did Eisenhower speak freely. In private letters and later reflections, Eisenhower admitted that Patton achieved results no system could reproduce. Other generals relied on planning and structure. Patton commanded through willpower. Where others hesitated, Patton accelerated. Where others saw risk, Patton saw opportunity. Eisenhower acknowledged something even more uncomfortable, that some of his decisions to restrain Patton may have prolonged the war. That politics sometimes overruled military logic, that Patton thrived precisely in the uncertainty where others froze. In his memoirs, Eisenhower chose a single word to describe Patton's role in the war: necessary, not admirable, not manageable, necessary. It was not praise, it was recognition. Some men are built for specific moments in history. Patton was built for war. Speed, aggression, chaos. In peace, those traits became faults. In war, they were decisive. Eisenhower went on to become president, guiding the United States through the early Cold War. He never commanded another army, but he never stopped thinking about Patton, about Camp Meade, about the Ardennes, about the cost of leading genius. America lost more than a general in December 1945. It lost a force of nature. Eisenhower had always known that truth. He simply could not say it until the consequences were gone. And that silence, finally broken, tells us as much about leadership as victory ever could. After the guns fell silent in Europe, the war entered a different phase, one without clear front lines or obvious enemies. For Dwight Eisenhower, this transition was as challenging as any battlefield decision he had faced. Victory demanded unity, restraint, and diplomacy. Yet the very man who had helped secure that victory represented the opposite of all three. George Patton had survived combat, controversy, and command reshuffles, but peace exposed him in ways war never had. He spoke too freely, too sharply, and with no patience for political nuance. While Eisenhower worked to stabilize occupied Germany, Patton publicly criticized denazification policies, comparing former Nazi Party members to American political factions. To Washington, these remarks were not merely embarrassing, they were dangerous. Eisenhower understood the broader stakes. The alliance with the Soviet Union was already fraying. Every word spoken by senior commanders was weighed by allies and enemies alike. Patton's blunt hostility toward the Soviets, though shared privately by many officers, could not be tolerated publicly. Eisenhower faced the reality that the qualities which made Patton indispensable in battle made him uncontrollable in occupation. Removing Patton was not an act of punishment. It was an act of containment. Patton sensed it immediately. His reassignment to a ceremonial role was a humiliation he could not hide. He grew restless, bitter, and isolated. Letters to friends reveal a man who felt discarded after giving everything to victory. He believed the war against Germany had simply been replaced by a coming war against communism, and that he was being silenced at the very moment his instincts mattered most. Eisenhower, meanwhile, carried the burden of command alone. He had protected Patton for years. After Sicily, after slapping incidents, after political outbursts. Each time, he absorbed criticism to preserve battlefield effectiveness. Now, with peace declared, there was no justification left. The nation wanted stability. Patton offered disruption. Their relationship, once built on mutual respect and unspoken trust, unraveled quietly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument that resolved anything. Just distance, just silence. Then, in early December 1945, Patton was injured in a car accident near Mannheim. What seemed at first survivable turned fatal. Within days, the general who had survived Africa, Sicily, France, and the Ardennes was gone. Eisenhower's reaction was private and profound. He did not attend the funeral. Some interpreted this as coldness. In truth, Eisenhower knew he could not stand before the grave without revealing what he had spent years suppressing. Patton's death removed the final barrier between Eisenhower and honesty. In later reflections, Eisenhower acknowledged that Patton was not merely a subordinate. He was a force that shaped decisions at the highest level. Eisenhower adjusted strategies knowing how Patton would react. He anticipated Patton's speed, relied on his aggression, and compensated for his recklessness. Commanding Patton was not about issuing orders. It was about harnessing momentum. This realization haunted Eisenhower. He understood that leadership is not only about choosing the right men, but about knowing when those men no longer fit the moment. The hardest decisions are not about enemies. They are about allies who become liabilities. Patton became a symbol of that dilemma. To the public, Patton was mythologized almost immediately. The fiery speeches, the pearl-handled pistols, the unstoppable advance across France. Hollywood would later cement him as a warrior larger than life. But Eisenhower remembered the cost behind the legend. The sleepless nights, the political pressure, the fear that Patton's next sentence could undo months of careful diplomacy. History often asks whether Eisenhower should have unleashed Patton more aggressively in the final months of the war, whether earlier freedom could have shortened the conflict. Eisenhower never answered directly, perhaps because he knew the truth was complicated. War is not won by one man alone, but it can be lost by one man out of control. In Patton, Eisenhower saw both extremes embodied in a single figure. That is why, when Eisenhower later spoke to young officers about command, he rarely mentioned tactics. He spoke instead about judgment, about restraint, about knowing when brilliance must be protected and when it must be limited. Patton's legacy forced Eisenhower to confront the uncomfortable truth that leadership is not about heroism. It is about balance, and sometimes about sacrifice without recognition. The war had ended, but for Eisenhower, its lessons were only beginning to surface. In the years that followed the war, the shadow of George Patton never truly left Dwight Eisenhower. As Eisenhower transitioned from Supreme Allied Commander to one of the most influential figures of the post-war world, the memory of Patton remained an unspoken reference point, a reminder of both the power and danger of unchecked force. Eisenhower entered a new kind of battlefield, one defined not by tanks and infantry, but by ideology, diplomacy, and nuclear tension. The Cold War was taking shape, and the United States required a different type of leadership than it had during the chaos of global conflict. Calm replaced aggression. Consensus replaced confrontation. And restraint became the highest virtue. Yet Eisenhower knew something the public rarely considered. Without men like Patton, there might not have been a post-war world left to stabilize. Privately, Eisenhower reflected on how history simplifies complex relationships. He understood that future generations would divide leaders into neat categories: heroes and villains, geniuses and liabilities. The truth, however, was far less comfortable. Patton was all of those things at once. He was a weapon that could only be used under specific conditions, and once those conditions disappeared, the weapon became dangerous to its own side. Eisenhower's presidency revealed just how deeply Patton's example had shaped him. As commander-in-chief, Eisenhower resisted pressure to use nuclear weapons during crises in Korea and beyond. He distrusted voices that demanded immediate, overwhelming force. Critics saw this as weakness. Eisenhower saw it as survival. He had already witnessed what happened when momentum went unchecked. The irony was impossible to ignore. Patton had believed the real war would begin after Germany fell. He had warned that the Soviet Union would become the next enemy, and that hesitation would cost the West dearly. In later decades, many claimed Patton had been right. The Cold War seemed to validate his instincts, if not his methods. But Eisenhower understood the distinction Patton never accepted. Being right about the enemy did not justify being reckless with power. This realization formed the core of Eisenhower's leadership philosophy. Strength without discipline was not strength at all. It was volatility. As historians revisited the Second World War, debates intensified. Could Patton have taken Berlin? Would fewer lives have been lost if Eisenhower had allowed him more freedom? These questions filled books, documentaries, and classrooms, yet they missed the deeper issue. Eisenhower was not commanding a single army. He was commanding an alliance. Patton thrived on singular authority. Eisenhower survived on compromise. That difference defined their entire relationship. When Eisenhower later addressed military academies, he spoke about Patton not as a cautionary tale, but as a lesson in limits. He described him as one of the greatest battlefield commanders America had ever produced: brilliant, fearless, and instinctive. But he also emphasized that greatness in war does not automatically translate to greatness in peace. The world Patton was built for no longer existed after 1945. Eisenhower's restraint helped prevent another global catastrophe. His patience allowed Europe to rebuild rather than collapse into renewed conflict. In this sense, Eisenhower won a second war, one that required suppressing the very instincts Patton embodied. And yet, Eisenhower never denied the personal cost. In private letters, he admitted that losing Patton, first as a commander, then as a man, felt like losing a part of the war itself. Patton represented clarity in a time of chaos. When Patton attacked, uncertainty vanished. The enemy reacted. Lines moved. Progress was visible. Peace offered no such clarity. That ambiguity weighed heavily on Eisenhower, especially as the nuclear age dawned. He understood that a future Patton, armed with weapons of unimaginable power, could end civilization in hours. The responsibility to prevent that outcome shaped every major decision of his presidency. History often celebrates boldness, but Eisenhower's legacy was built on refusal. Refusal to escalate. Refusal to react impulsively. Refusal to let the world drift into permanent war. In this way, Patton's influence lived on, not through imitation, but through contrast. Their story is not one of hatred or betrayal. It is the story of two men forged by the same war, who represented two incompatible answers to the same question. How far should power be allowed to go? Patton answered with speed, aggression, and certainty. Eisenhower answered with patience, control, and restraint. Both answers were necessary, but only one could shape the future. That is why, when the history of the war is stripped of spectacle and legend, the relationship between Eisenhower and Patton remains one of its most important lessons. Not because they disagreed, but because they needed each other, even when the cost was unbearable. The war was won on the battlefield. The peace was won in the silence that followed. And somewhere between those two victories stands the memory of a general who was too dangerous to unleash and too valuable to forget.